So, good afternoon. Thank you for coming out on this pleasant Thursday afternoon. Before I get started, I too would like to take a moment to thank some of the same people. It's amazing that Tanzine mentioned Omar and Danea and Hannibal, very good friends of mine, and I'm glad that they made that connection and helped make this happen. So I want to thank Tanzine Doha, of course, from the Department of Anthropology and Program in Critical Theory, the Black Student Union, Critical Anti-Colonial Studies, Faces of African Muslims, and the Islamic Third World Coalition for inviting me out here. I'd also like to thank my wife, Anita Wilkins, whose intellectual labors have been of great help to me as I develop my own particular interventions in this project that Saidiya Hartman, who's a professor at Columbia University, has called Afro-pessimism. I get the credit for it because I put it in my book, but I'm just a product manager. It actually comes from an interview that I did with Saidiya Hartman. It was supposed to be an interview when I was a grad student in the rhetoric department at UC Berkeley. As it turned out, when I transcribed the interview, it turned out that Saidiya, my professor and interviewee, spoke for 6,000 words, and I had spoken for 6,300 words. So there you go. Hubris at low places. But okay. So this presentation is a snapshot of a chapter I published in Germany while I was on an Alexander von Humboldt Experience Research Fellowship at the University of Bremen. The anthology is titled, it's out now, it just came out a few months ago, it's titled Postcoloniality, Decoloniality, Black Critique, Joints and Fissures. Postcoloniality, Decoloniality, Black Critique, Joints and Fissures. And it's edited by Sabina Brock and Karsten Junkerts through a press in Frankfurt. But it's also it's also a snapshot of kind of what I'm working on for my next book, thinking about the compassionately thinking about failures and disruptions in political projects with a central focus on the Black Liberation Army and Assata Shakur and her comrades. So, in this chapter, I argue that the regime of violence which subsumes black people is different from the regime of violence which subsumes exploited workers and hyper-exploited post-colonial subalterns. Rather than proceed by way of a sociological explanation of paramilitary bombings, bank expropriations, and the elimination of state and civilian personnel, I proceed by way of a symptomatic reading of the political communiques these paramilitaries released in order to explain and lend legitimacy to their insurgent actions. I contend that the antagonism between the black or the slave on one hand and the worker and the post-colonial subaltern on the other hand can be clarified through a comparative and symptomatic reading of their respective political communiques. What such a comparison reveals is not a dissonance at the level of political content, because the BLA, the IRA, and the RAF in Germany, all these insurgents called themselves Marxists and anti-imperialists. But it reveals something far more startling, a revelation regarding the inherent anti-blackness in the ontological status of narrative itself. In other words, what we find is that narrative's anti-black ontology forecloses upon the capacity of the black insurgents' political communique to secure coherence and to act as a conduit for relational labor, regardless of its political content. This is because the regime of violence which exceeds and anticipates the black position is so comprehensive as to eliminate the capacity for what is known in narratology and psychoanalysis as third-term mediators, those trans-individual icons and concepts of which non-blacks can avail themselves in order to weight their discourse in the symbolic as opposed to the imaginary. We'll begin with a communique from BLA soldier Assata Shakur, and I think that most people have the communiques there. Assata Shakur was captured on the New Jersey Turnpike in 1973 during a shootout with state troopers that left one BLA paramilitary dead and one police officer dead. She was shot in the chest and then dragged onto the road and kicked and punched by police officers who demanded to know in which direction her comrade, Sundiata Acoli, had fled. She spent 4 years in and out of court on trumped-up charges for a series of so-called crimes, such as bank expropriations. Assata spent her first month in the Middlesex County Workhouse, hammering out a communique intended to counter the police and press campaigns portraying her as a common criminal going around, as she wrote, shooting down cops for the hell of it. She says, I had to make a statement. So it begins like this. Black brothers, black sisters, I want you to know that I love you, and I hope that somewhere in your hearts you have love for me. My name is Assata Shakur, slave name Joanne Chesimard, and I am a revolutionary, a black revolutionary. By that I mean that I have declared war on all the forces that have raped our women, castrated our men, and kept our babies empty bellied. I have declared war on the rich who prosper on our poverty, the politicians who lie to us with smiling faces, and all the mindless, heartless robots who protect them and their property. I am a black revolutionary, and as such, I am a victim of all the wrath, hatred, and slander that America is capable of. Like all other black revolutionaries, America is trying to lynch me. I am a black revolutionary woman, and because of this, I have been charged with and accused of every alleged crime in which a woman was believed to have participated. The alleged crimes in which only men were supposedly involved, I have been accused of planning. They have plastered pictures alleged to be me in post offices, airports, hotels, police cars, subways, banks, television, and newspapers. They have offered over $50,000 in rewards for my capture, and they have issued orders to shoot on sight and to shoot to kill. I am a black revolutionary, and by definition, that makes me part of the Black Revolutionary Army. The pigs have used their newspapers and TVs to paint the Black Liberation Army as vicious, brutal, mad dog criminals. They have called us gangsters and gun laws and have compared us to such characters as John Dillinger and Ma Barker. It should be clear, it must be clear to anyone who can think, see, or hear that we are the victims and not the criminals. Okay. Assata Shakur begins her communique by declaring her love for black people. But there's a note of uncertainty as to their love for her. Quote, I hope that somewhere in your hearts you have love for me. This is an early example of something that troubles the communique from beginning to end, that there is no third term, no mediating object, which can be called upon as third-term semiotic markers in self-representation. In, for example, her explanation of the change of her name from Joanne Chesimard to Assata Shakur, the third-term semiotic marker, the mediating object, is slavery, which is to say, the abyss of social death, as opposed to a site of culture or economic plenitude, like a lost nation. In other words, the signifier that mediates this aspect of a presumed relation to a presumed people is really the absence of signification, rather than an event or a place within signification. It is a trace, as Saidiya Hartman writes, it is a trace of memory which functions in the manner akin to a phantom limb, in that what is felt is no longer there. It is a sentient recollection of connectedness experienced at the site of rupture, where the very consciousness of disconnectedness acts as a mode of testimony. And as such, it cannot function as a catalyst for a return to an originary plenitude. That from Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection, which I'm sure many people have seen. Nor, as we scale up the ladder of abstraction, do we find the plenitude of mediating objects which most post-colonial and Marxist paramilitaries take for granted. In the article, The Dialogical Self in Thirdness, a semiotic approach to positioning using dialogical triads, Peter Raggett reminds us of Charles Saunders Peirce's semiotic deployment of the idea of thirdness as the influence of one subject on a second subject mediated by a third. Third-term mediators are distinctive, Raggett argues, because they have a doubled quality, defining both similarities and differences between opposing positions. Land, labor power, and cultural artifacts, such as language and customs, are often the third-term mediators as we move up the scale of abstraction in paramilitary political communiques. The Black Liberation Army did, in fact, take positions on the land question, in which they demanded that most of the southeastern United States, what is known as the Black Belt, be given to the descendants of slaves to form an independent country called New Africa. I want to bracket the objection that this land belongs to the Cherokee and other so-called civilized tribes, that it wasn't the BLA's land to claim or reclaim. While one can only agree with that argument, I think it misses the point. The point is that social death is a condition void not of land, but of a capacity to secure relational status through transindividual or mediating objects, be those objects elaborated by land, labor, or love. My argument is not that the BLA's politics were ethical or unethical, but that the genome of political discourse is inherently anti-black. The inherent anti-blackness of political discourse can be discerned by discovering the anti-blackness of narrative itself, by examining how the ontology of basic elements which constitute narrative are themselves constituted by the violence of slavery, and how and why those narrative elements are related by a genealogical isolate. Genealogical isolate being what Orlando Patterson calls the third definition of slavery, natal alienation. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. Now, in a post-colonial political communique, a communique written by an insurgent who is not black, Assata Shakur's phrase, "I have declared war," would typically function as what's known as a chronotope. A chronotope is a spatial temporal fragment. In the book, The Dialogical Imagination, Bakhtin writes, come on in, there's plenty of seats here, and there's some handouts there also. In The Dialogical Imagination, Bakhtin writes, quote, "We will give the name chronotope, literally time-space, to the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships that are expressed in literature. In the chronotope, time thickens, takes on flesh, becomes visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. The intersection of axes and fusion of indicators characterizes the chronotope." That from Bakhtin. The Bakhtinian chronotope is one narrative element whose ontological status is ruptured when it is deployed as an element in the slave's narrative. And the slave is the primary figure in narrative, such as the discourse of liberation. A 1,300-year carceral continuum, the African trade slave from the Arabs to the Europeans, incarcerates and suppresses the elements which are deployed to produce what Bakhtin called the dialogical imagination. Reciprocation, reversals, hybrid amalgamations, all this becomes unsustainable when the figure in narrative is black. We should note, however, that before the chronotope is manifest in discourse, and before it is refashioned and deployed in the narrative of liberation, its assumptive logic comes to us with capacities the slave does not possess. The capacity to transpose time into event, and the capacity to transpose space into place. Assata Shakur's communiqué is not a postcolonial or Marxist communiqué, even though its narrative intent aspires to recognition and incorporation by way of its assumptive logics. We see that even though the chronotope of resistance time is repeated several times, and the repetition of what Bakhtin might call resistance time in Assata's communiqué could be represented by the phrase, "I am a black revolutionary." Okay, even though this is repeated several times, it cannot establish a relay between itself, the phrase, and a mediating object, such as land or labor power, which can be recognized and incorporated as an object of loss. For Bakhtin, the integrity of the chronotope depends on its being de-linked from certainty. I know this sounds counterintuitive, but it'll make sense in a moment. The integrity of the chronotope depends on its being de-linked from certainty. Resistance time should not, for Bakhtin, be embedded with the certainty of victory, but with an uncertainty which rests upon the labors of human agency. Its life force is not contained in the realization that the post-colonial subject will get her land back eventually, but in the realization that the outcome of the conflict is up for grabs. The guaranteed return of land is not what imbues a people with their collective sense of futurity. On the contrary, it is the knowledge that the outcome is not known. This heightens their sense of urgency, intensifies their experience of themselves as beings who are alive, whose agency might fail or succeed in their efforts to remake the world. Bakhtin writes, quote, "Nothing conclusive has yet taken place in the world. The ultimate word of the world and about the world has not yet been spoken. The world is open and free. Everything is still in the future and will always be in the future." Close quote. Now in the article, the chronotopes of humanness, Bakhtin and Dostoevsky, Gary Saul Morson amplifies Bakhtin's assertion that the dialogical situation does not follow any preset path. It does not unfold, Morson writes, it becomes. Because, quote, the same conversational starting point can always lead to multiple continuations. For life to be meaningful, Morson continues, quote, the world must really be uncertain in this sense, and we must experience it as such. Determinism destroys uncertainty, while capital punishment destroys the sense of uncertainty. The horror of absolute certainty explains the remarkable image of a man begging for mercy even after his throat has been cut. The victim may know that he is sure to die, but so unacceptable is that knowledge that he acts as if his throat were only just about to be cut. Morson writes, he manufactures suspense. Now, David Marriott is a UC Santa Cruz professor and critical theorist whose psychoanalytic explanations of the role mutilated, dying, and dead black men play in the psychic life of culture. Marriott's view of dead black men clashes with the idea that all lives can be made meaningful, as Morson's vignette of a dying man suggests. There are, however, profound ways in which David Marriott agrees with Gary Morson. Marriott would concur that determinism does in fact destroy uncertainty, and that capital punishment destroys the sense of uncertainty. But Marriott would choose a different image to illustrate what Morson calls the horror of absolute certainty. Instead of borrowing Morson's image of a man whose throat has been slit, David Marriott borrows Assata Shakur's image of castration. Once this happens, the analogy between Morson's dying man and Marriott's dying man breaks down. The ontological implication of two men bleeding to death cannot be reconciled. Compare Morson's dying man. On the one hand, Morson says, the horror of absolute certainty explains the remarkable image of a man begging for mercy after his throat has been cut. The victim may know he is sure to die, but so unacceptable is that knowledge that he acts as if his throat were only just about to be cut. He manufactures suspense, so he narrates suspense. So compare that to David Marriott's dying man. Marriott begins by quoting from a 1934 book titled The Lynching of Claude Neal. And he's quoting from a quote in the book. Okay. He writes, he's quoting one of the lynchers who write. One of the lynchers writes, after taking the nigger to the woods, they cut off his penis. He was made to eat it. Then they cut off his testicles and made him eat them and say he liked it. These are the words of a white man who was there and probably took part in the festivities. David Marriott continues. The act of forcing a man to fuck himself to death with his own excised genitals, to feed and gorge himself on his own violated pleasure, may well have been highly satisfying to those assembled, especially when the man got to confess his own seeming enjoyment. To hear him desire his own death, and so turn their terrible pleasure into his own violent wish, was to construct a vision of a castrated black man as one actively seeking the pleasures of his own castration. Close quote. So, the determinism that Gary Morson laments in his cautionary tale about how life goes askew when conditions necessary to Bakhtinian dialogue are corrupted is a determinism which is situated in the realm of experience. We know this because even as the man with the slit throat is dying, he still has a hand in the tyranny of narrative closure that will end his life, and also in his sense of life. Morson calls the injunction that prevents a dialogical situation, he calls that capital punishment. In other words, we have arrived at this moment of the slit throat because the victim has transgressed some code, some law, for which he is being punished. But the lynching victim, in Marriott's example, is not being punished, even if the lynchers claim that he is being punished. Marriott implies that punishment is a ruse, a secondary consideration at best. What the scene is really about is the lynchers' ritual of self-making. Through this ritual, they fashion themselves as selves. The man being lynched has no ontological resistance, to quote Fanon, in their eyes, which may explain why he, the lynched victim, unlike Morrison's victim, doesn't waste his last precious moments manufacturing suspense. Morrison's victim finds the knowledge of his certain death, the determined end to his life of uncertainty, to be unacceptable. David Marriott's man knows that such a posture reeks of agency, reeks of entitlement, reeks of a man who may be dying but who will carry his unconscious to the grave with him. In contradistinction, the lynching ritual demands of its victim much more than death. The violence is all around this victim, but it is inside him as well. His psychic capacity to manufacture suspense, to possess, that is, his own desire, has been usurped by the desire of his lynchers. No executioner makes such demands on behalf of the state. As Marriott writes, the lynching victim must turn the lyncher's terrible pleasure into his own violent wish. In his dying moments, he must pursue white pleasure through his own castration. Something more profound and ineffable than determinism is at work here, because determinism implies a temporary injunction against narrative sequencing, and by extension, against political activity. An injunction against what Bakhtin describes as a dialogical situation. What Marriott is describing is a permanent injunction against ontology. Whether that ontology is experienced as the determinism of capital punishment or as the uncertainty of the dialogical situation. The sentient being in Morrison's cautionary tale enters the event of capital punishment as a subject. And he takes his human inheritance with him to the grave. His neurotic machinations are proof of this. The sentient being, in Marriott's example, the slave or the black, cannot even savor some form of neurotic pleasure in his own annihilation. The photographs of Assata Shakur that she writes about in her political communiqué, or of some black women who may have or may not have looked like her, are photographs that graced post offices, airports, hotels, and banks, and labor like the photographs of lynching victims, which became postcards to be circulated well beyond the time and place of the ghastly event. The photographs of Assata were not photographs whose main purpose was to catch a so-called political terrorist. That would be too simple. That would be too human. They were photographs in which she, Assata, like the lynched man, became a figure in a public event. A figure whose political agenda and motive will was never under consideration. A figure who was always already an implement to help the human, and I need to be clear here, by human I mean not only whites, but Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and non-black women of color, whites and their junior partners, to help the human fashion selfhood, to help them secure the integration and closure of their bodily schemas, to help them facilitate the identification with their fellow citizens, who they may never meet. Nonetheless, these dead implements, these lynched victims, and the images of them which circulate in all their mutilated splendor are the genetic material of civil society, the DNA of human life. The conscious declarations of Assata Shakur's political communiqué, and by her conscious declarations I mean her Marxist and postcolonial intention, struggle to insert something within blackness that is prior to the devastation that defines blackness. But the force of the repetition compulsion with which the communiqué lists, illustrates, and returns to this devastation is vertiginous. Quote, I am a victim of all the wrath, hatred, and slander that America is capable of. America is trying to lynch me. The pigs have used their newspapers and TVs to paint the Black Liberation Army as vicious, brutal, mad dog criminals. The communiqué contains few narrative fragments which can be cobbled together with enough muscle to check this devastation, to act on it in a contrapuntal way. This is not a case of the compulsion to repeat, which Freud describes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, where the repetition is something that seems more elementary, more instinctual than the pleasure principle which it overrides. Because Assata Shakur's communiqué contains no political strategy and no therapeutic agency through which the violence which engulfs her flesh can be separated from the text's compulsion to repeat that violence. In a normal situation, a therapeutic and or political intervention could be made to, in the case of therapy, help the subject become aware of a distinction between the violence she may indeed encounter from the state and a range of psychic alternatives to letting that violence consume her unconscious. And in the case of politics, the vision elaborated by a social movement could help the subject imagine a new day, and thus imbue state violence with a temporal plenitude, such as is heard in the phrase, "Our day will come," from the Irish Republicans, as they used to say, and so it did, even if the subject doesn't live to experience that plenitude. But recourse to political and therapeutic resources presumed our men and kept our babies empty-bellied. Assata Shakur claims for herself and for black people in general a gendered integrity which the unconscious symptoms of her text, The Violent Swirl, indicate are not recognized by the world in which she lives. It is as though by positing these horrific sexual violations in a manner which is properly gendered, one which regulates, for example, castration to men and rape to women, the communiqué offers her and her black readers the protection of a sanctuary that they otherwise might not have. It is not, of course, sanctuary from actual rapes and castration, but the sanctuary of gendered recognition and incorporation which emplotment in a narrative continuum provides. The event of gender, equilibrium, is now being violated by rape or castration, disequilibrium. And this turn of events is the essence of agency through which equilibrium can be restored. So what I'm saying is that in a normal communiqué where one could actually claim gendered positionality, and in other words, where Saidiya Hartman's argument about the absence of gender is predicated on the absence of consent. In a normal situation like that, what you'd have is a gendered position to be violated and then to be corrected through either adjudication or retaliation. In other words, imbued in the political communiqué would be you'd have the integrity of a narrative arc. A narrative arc moves from equilibrium to disequilibrium to the restoration of equilibrium. Whether that is an analytic narrative of the Marxist nature or a classical narrative of bourgeois Hollywood nature, the arc is still ontologically manifest in narrative. So I'm saying that Assata's claims to this kind of violation are not borne out because the violence that subsumes her body is greater than the potential for narrative to actually make sense of that violence. Saidiya Hartman writes, if the definition of the crime of rape relies upon the capacity to give consent or exercise will, then how does one make legible the sexual violation of the enslaved when that which would constitute evidence of intentionality and thus evidence of a crime, the state of consent or willingness of the assailed, opens a Pandora's box in which the subject formation and object constitution of the enslaved female are no less ponderous than the crime itself, or when the legal definition of the enslaved negates the very idea of reasonable resistance. We might also consider whether the wanton and indiscriminate uses of the captive body can be made sense of within the heteronormative framing of sexual violation as rape, Hartman writes. So, in other words, by parceling out rape to women and castration to men, Assata Shakur's political communiqué offers the black author and the black reader a sense that their political agency is something more than mere borrowed institutionality. And it saves the black insurgent from the realization that the dust-up is not between workers and bosses, the dust-up is not between settlers and natives, not between queer and the straight, but between the living and the dead. If we look closely, we also see that gender itself cannot be reconciled with the slave's genealogical isolation. That for the slave, there is no surplus value to be restored to the time of labor, and that no treaties between blacks and humans are in Washington waiting to be signed and ratified. And that unlike the settler in the Native American political imagination, there is no place like Europe to which the slave can return the human being. Postcolonial and Marxist communiques are assimilated by a range of trans-individual icons, images and concepts which secure their communiques' coherence. Consider Sean on your sheet there, Sean McStyfen's, he's the first chief of staff of the IRA, his communique. It reads like this. The nationally minded, the Irish-minded people of the North know that the IRA is their army, is the revolutionary army of the Irish people. They know that many IRA volunteers have died fighting in defense of their areas. They know they will never be able to lead a normal, peaceful, and happy life until the British imperialist presence has been removed from this country. Okay. Land, in this communique, as a trans-individual third term, mediates a dialogical situation, one which implies a rich field of semiotic play at a level of abstraction which is higher than Assata Shakur's level of abstraction. McStyfen's communique enables him to enter the list of similarities and differences more indicative of the symbolic push and pull of hegemonic struggle. Over, for example, the status of national identity, the value of political martyrdom, and the restoration of civil society, all of which grounds his discourse in a kind of sanity, which is indicative of how well the symbolic push and pull protects him from the imaginary's collisions of murder and absolute identification found throughout Assata Shakur's communique. His communique can enter into the realm of politics, a world of surprise endings and possibilities with back to uncertainty. The narrative will not fold in on itself. It can escape the loop of repetitions, a loop that would otherwise crowd out politics because it crowds out agency. The political agency resides in the uncertain outcome of the struggle over trans-individual objects. Trans-individual because they secure political ontology for the British and the Republicans alike. The question McStyfen's communique poses is who will prevail on a conceptual level, the question of who is alive and who is dead, as in the case of the human and the slave. Assata Shakur's political communique starts much closer to the body than the IRA or the Red Army faction. When she says she hopes that her people love her, she is intimating something deeper than a question of affection. There is a paradigmatic, ontological question here as well. There is no need for Sean McStyfen to solicit Catholic working class affection because the question of love has already been mediated through and by the concept of land. In other words, it is not a question of McStyfen's subjectivity which is at stake. Affection is not so mimetic in this situation as to make it an all or nothing proposition. This is because land acts as a third term, a grounding wire, which shifts the affect from one of immediacy to one of mediacy. It takes the neurotic charge on the question of love. It makes love a symbolic and therefore negotiated endeavor, one which has a range of possible outcomes and interpretations, rather than a precursor to the confirmation or denial of his existence. McStyfen has no need for the reader to recognize and incorporate his psychic presence through a declaration of love, because his psychic presence has already been secured a priori by his and Irish people's and British people's shared capacity to inhabit and transform meaningless space into meaningful place. McStyfen is a person and the Irish are his people because they are always already cartographically located. Even at the time of the communiqué's release, when their communiqué was occupied, when their land was occupied by the British. And this is where temporality and spatiality cross. There was a time of place, even though it was almost 1,000 years ago. Therefore, there can be a time of place again when the British are driven away. You see, we have again equilibrium, disequilibrium, equilibrium restored. This is the generic arc of all narratives. This secures the ontological status of narrative. Third-term mediators facilitate narrative progression, even when they do not bear the tactile solidity of spatial metaphors. The narrative arc of equilibrium, disequilibrium, equilibrium restored, still maintains its moorings in the realm of the symbolic. That is to say, it and its authors are protected from the ravages of the imaginary, even though the event of equilibrium restored promises the restoration of an abstraction whose referent is hard to concretize. Now, the olive tree is a common symbol of Palestinian third term, is a common symbol of a Palestinian third term mediator. So it's what I'm saying is that the third, when a political communique is based on a third term mediator that is cartographic, it's easier to kind of see and interpret. But it also, such as the olive tree, one of the things that Edward Said writes about, like the key that he carried with him to Egypt after the Nakba. But we should also be able to see third-term mediators working temporally, not just cartographically. So since you have a situation where the olive tree or the key or the door or the house would be a third-term cartographic mediator, and that could be shared by a number of say, critical theorists or artists, no two artists would paint the same portrait of lost labor time restored. So now we're moving into temporality and how that works. Ulrike Meinhof's Red Army faction communique of third-term mediators is able to work temporally without, to a large extent, the tactile solidity of spatial metaphors such as land. So 3 years before Assata Shakur's communique To My People, Ulrike Meinhof issued one of the first Red Army faction communiques in which, on behalf of the RAF paramilitaries, she argued that urban guerrilla warfare represents, quote, the only revolutionary method of intervention available to what are, on the whole, weak revolutionary forces. Now, in the interest of time, to start to wind down, I won't read Meinhof's communique. You have it there as a handout. But I'll make a few points. And my point is that, like Sean McStyfen's invocation of cartography, Ulrike Meinhof deploys, so if McStyfen, the IRA guy, if he's deploying cartography, Meinhof is deploying temporality in order to secure coherence via the narrative arc of equilibrium, disequilibrium, and equilibrium restored. And so her communique maintains its mooring in the realm of the symbolic. This is how it maintains its coherence. Ulrike Meinhof's communique's coherence is secured and stabilized because Ulrike Meinhof and her readers are assimilated by the event, temporally transposed into something coherent. Not by this or that event, but by event as a formal instantiation of human endeavors. It must be re-emphasized that the event is not in service to political agreement. It is in service to symbolic exchange, to the elaboration of a dialogic context, where the transindividual modalities of cartography labor to this end in the IRA political communique. Ulrike Meinhof's communique is anchored in its transindividual inheritance and heritage temporality. The working day swans throughout Ulrike Meinhof's text without needing to be named. The character of the working day is what the RAF and the capitalists struggle over, not the coherence of labor time itself. To be sure, this is a high-stakes struggle, because the violence of the state, as the violence of the state and Ulrike Meinhof's counter-violence indicate, over the character and ownership of labor time. So they're struggling not over the actual chronotype. That remains stable. They're struggling over its literary and narrative manifestation. Which is to say, will labor time be exploited and by those who consume it, or will it be exploited by those who work? But it is not a struggle over the narrative coherence of labor time itself. So in order to start winding down, I want to give a few, I won't give a full account of the analysis I offer in the book that I told you, the German anthology, and this is also going to be further developed in my forthcoming book. But let me summarize some of my interventions. The event of labor time is a trans-individual mediating object which facilitates intra-human coherence by way of class warfare. We struggle over the event being the time of labor, is a struggle over the character of temporal capacity. It is not a struggle which threatens temporal capacity writ large. In other words, the Red Army faction violence is in service to a project which infuses chronology with ethics, a violence which enables a pilgrim's progress from mystification to clarification, or from capitalism to communism. This makes urban guerrilla warfare something very different for Meinhof and McStyfane than it is for Assata Shakur. What Ulrike Meinhof's communiqué is saying is that urban guerrilla warfare is that force which contributes to the unmasking of capitalist social relations. The crisis in civil society which this brings about will catalyze a more essential unmasking of the commodity form's circuit of displacement, substitution, and signification. Meinhof and McStyfane think they will undo the world in this way and bring about a new paradigm. But by leaving the violence of black revolt out of the equation, their proletariat and post-colonial violence destroys the myth of a capitalist or colonizing omnipresence and invulnerability, while it simultaneously reinvigorates the generative mechanisms of human life, or the symbolic order. Mechanisms which are not available to the slave. Revolutionary strategies which unmask the hypothesized form that value, or the commodity, takes as it masks both its differential and social relations. These strategies experience the humiliation of their explanatory power when confronted with the black. The black has no social relations to be either masked or unmasked. Not, that is, in a structural sense. Social relations depend on various pretenses to the contrary. Therefore, what gets masked in Meinhof and McStyfane's revolutionary violence is, as we shall see, the matrix of violence that makes black relationality an oxymoron. To relate socially, one must enter a social drama's mise-en-scène with spatial and temporal coherence. In other words, one must enter the mise-en-scène with human capacity. Assata Shakur is not so much the antithesis of human capacity, because that might imply a dialectic potential in the slave's encounter with the world, as she is the absence of human capacity. There is no shortness of breath, no unmoored flights of impressionism in Meinhof's and McStyfane's legitimation of terror. Not because they are brave and committed, but because compared to Assata Shakur, the spatial, temporal context from which they espouse terror is really not so terrifying. Everywhere you look, the terror they describe and the terror that they unleash has symbolic resonance and legitimation. Therefore, terrorism, as a way of characterizing IRA violence against the British, or terrorism as a way of characterizing RAF violence against the West German upper class loses its universal horror and is made relative by how one human lives her symbolic presence with, through, and against the symbolic presence of another human. This shared context of symbolic resonance and legitimation, a dialogic context, continues to exist once the state has quashed non-black paramilitaries. To put it differently, but no less to the point, the so-called terror unleashed by, for example, the Red Army faction's violence against the German state, this violence did more to secure social relations than it did to shred them. I know that sounds counterintuitive, and I'll argue it. Maybe I won't prove it. Take it on faith. No. Okay. It did more to secure social relations than it did to shred them. Intra-human violence functions as the rebar of relationality, rather than as the wrecking ball of relationality, as both the liberal left and the neoliberal right would have us believe. In other words, the pageantry of strike, counter-strike, which, the police, the West German police hitting, and then the RAF blowing up NATO bases or blowing up newspapers, the pageantry of strike, counter-strike intensified white Germans' proclivity to imagine political conflict, which is to say, of filial struggles through filial frames. So what I'm saying is that in the literature, when I was in Germany, what kind of intrigued me but freaked me out a bit was that, the amount of the death toll of the RAF, and there were several generations of RAF insurgents moving from the 60s, late 60s, all the way up into the 90s. And it seemed that the more they killed, the more entrenched the West Germans actually became cathected or psychically invested in a narrative of family. In other words, thinking of these, what they call them terrorists, but wayward children at the same time. And that's precisely the kind of unconscious labor that never happened with the Black Liberation Army, who really only launched about 66 operations compared to the hundreds launched by the RAF. And I find that to be very interesting. So a filial struggle would be the struggle between the working class and the ruling class. And to ratchet down the scale of abstraction and think on a filial struggle through filiation. In other words, to think class warfare through the discourse of a family feud. I mean, that's really kind of profound to me. I mean, that's, I'd like to be thought of like that. Just a wayward son. But and so I'm saying that there's something going on in the collective unconscious when white people commit terror, that it's not a generous gesture that happens when black people do it. So throughout the critical and journalistic literature, the good German dilemma, raised by the strike, counter-strike violence, throughout all of this, questions of citizenship and state power, which would ordinarily be categorized as filial dilemmas involving transpersonal forms of authority, such as class and hegemony, are displaced onto the good wife dilemma. Was Ulrike Meinhof a good wife or a bad wife because she left her kids to go bank robbery? The dilemma of the good daughter, the good son, the good father, or the good mother. Questions which would ordinarily be categorized as filial. In other words, they went from questions of forms of authority and class to questions of natural forms of authority involving obedience, fear, love, respect, and instinctual conflict. The RAF violence wove a tapestry of articulations. It didn't break civil society, it brought civil society together. It wove a tapestry of articulations, connections, transfers, and displacements between affilial frames of reference and filial frames of reference, in which the filial frame was primarily hegemonic. That's really interesting. For the simple reason that it orients and grounds the scholarship and journalism in the manner of a faith-based initiative. without the need for justification or explanation of its deployment. Intra-human political violence has such a disruptive effect in the realm of experience, because people die, that it can harden political and social attitudes for years. But, and here's my argument, it is also a balm, B-A-L-M. I know I've been saying bomb. This is a good thing. It is also, or that is a good thing, depending upon where you are. It is also a balm, B-A-L-M, a means of relational therapy which elaborates strategies for human renewal. And these strategies are themselves the effects of the fusion of symbolic resonances through which relationality and subjectivity as formal entities are constituted. Now, the thing to bear in mind is how profoundly unmarked a black paramilitary's plight is by this messiness and contrariness of civil society and recognition and incorporation. The pageantry of strike and counterstrike between the Black Liberation Army and the state never could have elaborated such a renewal of human kinship, at least not one in which the black paramilitaries in particular and black people in general could be imagined as members of the human family. It did not promote civic debate about the affilial isolation of black people with respect to civil society and political economy. It did not facilitate a reimagining of black people, as human kin. Sundiata Acoli and Assata Shakur's co-defendant in the New Jersey Turnpike shootout had been a computer programmer for NASA prior to joining the Black Liberation Army. He was an accomplished mathematician who wrote software for the USA's first lunar landing. The aspect of his biography does nothing for him when he comes up for parole. He cannot be reconstituted as a former contributing member of society who helped put a man on the moon. Instead, he has been denied parole at least 9 times in the last 40 years. In 2010, at the age of 73, the parole board gave him a 10-year hit. Meaning a 10-year. The BLA soldiers go up for parole and they add time, which is sort of illegal. He was given a 10-year hit, which means that he must serve an additional 6 years. He will be 79 years old when and if he gets out of prison. In 2012, Assata Shakur, a 65-year-old grandmother of political exile living in Cuba with 3 bullets in her chest, a member of a routed paramilitary organization, someone who is so isolated that she often has to go underground in Cuba to evade bounty hunters who slink from Key West to Cuba in light sea crafts in hopes of capturing her and cashing in on the now $2 million reward. She became the first woman to be added to the FBI's most wanted terrorist list. American civil society has never argued over her fitness as a mother, her rebirth as an educator, or whether her femininity should be compared, as they did with Ulrike Meinhof, whether her femininity should be compared with fashions of saints. And William Rosenau, who is a government-sanctioned analyst, he consoles his readers by claiming that today the U.S. faces no clear and present danger from another black American paramilitary offensive such as those that occurred in the 1970s. So she's on the most wanted list, and yet the analysts are saying there's no threat of this. Per capita, more black young men and women are in chains and cages than at the height of chattel slavery. Government-assisted drug trafficking has decimated the black urban landscape. Fewer blacks are enrolled in tertiary educational institutions than there were prior to the advent of affirmative action. And the white American radical allies who in the 60s and 70s wanted to change the world succumbed to ennui and changed their minds. At whatever scale of abstraction one might want to consider the FBI's adding Assata Shakur to its list of most wanted terrorists, it would be hard to imagine the logic in it. That's because it is not logical. It is pre-logical. Pre-logical in the sense that the collective unconscious of law enforcement as an integral part of the collective unconscious of the socius, understands that Assata Shakur is a symbolic threat, but not in the same way that Ulrike Meinhof is a symbolic threat. Meinhof is a threat to stable arrangements of symbolism, both filio, the wayward daughter with a gun who threatens to unhinge the name of the father, and affilio, the wrathful anti-imperialist with a gun who threatens to unhinge capitalist hegemony. Assata, on the other hand, threatens not symbolic arrangements. She is not recognized and incorporated by such arrangements. Assata Shakur threatens the symbolic order itself. A workers' revolution blows the lid off political economy. A post-colonial revolution blows the lid off the colony. A slave revolt blows the lid off the unconscious. The slave does not threaten capitalism with a new economic order. The slave does not threaten capitalism with a new economic order, nor does the slave threaten filiation with a new non-patriarchal order. The slave threatens order itself, whether manifest as an economic struggle between the capitalist and the worker, or as a genealogical struggle between parent and child. In other words, Assata Shakur is a threat to the symbolic legibility and psychic coherence of humanity writ large. The textual heat of Assata Shakur's communiqué is not cathected by transindividual concepts like land and labor power, but instead is dispersed throughout an array of bodily violations, horrifying images indexical of structural rupture of her capacity to lay claim to transindividual concepts, to mediating objects. In Assata Shakur's communiqué, we do not get a picture of someone whose native land has been stolen. We do not get a picture of someone whose labor power has been usurped, or whose culture has been quashed and corrupted. Instead, we get a picture of someone whose condition of possibility is elaborated by violence, a violence too comprehensive to comprehend, violence without analogy, violence so totalizing it prevents the closure of her bodily schema. When the black paramilitary picks up the gun, the crisis on the horizon is not one of a radical shift in the temporal drama of value, as Meinhof would have it, nor one which portends a new and disorienting map, as McStoyfane would have it for a liberated Ireland. It is not a crisis which looms, not a crisis which looms. What looms is a catastrophe of symbolic catacity, for no symbols can represent what black violence pretends. I'll leave you with a poem that I wrote to the last chapter of my memoir, Incognito. The poem is titled, and I think it has some kind of aesthetic resonance with what I've been saying here. It's titled The Convocation of Conquest. My chair was missing from the table, an oversight, I'm sure. Standing there, I considered the distance we'd walked just to arrive, and the horses, apathetic to the prey of their riders, gaining in spite of themselves, with heads so enormous, cold mist from their nostrils fell upon the moon, upon you and me, and the men and women we took with us from the corners of sleep. One dream, one table, one people with one unnameable loss, and no place set, even aside. Thank you.
Question and answer, Q&A. Would you like to take a break? Or
No, let's go right into it.
Okay. If you have questions, please.
As on all campuses, anti-black violence, and they have on, you go to change.org and you look up UCI, BSU. I would ask you to look up the demands of the BSU because they're in a struggle to implement these demands that will begin to redress some of the problems. But the administration is stalling. And how many are you, we have another problem which is connected. How many of you are aware of the flag flap at UC Irvine? Oh, most people, okay. So the crossover is that one of the students who wrote they drafted the resolution to ban flag, not from the campus, I'm really paranoid about that, but from a little student commons room, is also a member of the BSU executive on the demands team. And what's really interesting is that she is getting not just a lot of the bulk of the death threats, but they're targeted at her sexually, and they are lynching and horrible things that I can't even repeat. The long and the short of it is that the chancellor said to the 6 students who drafted this resolution, if you apologize to the Orange County community, we will offer you protection with the campus police. But if you don't apologize, you're kind of on your own. So in a sense, he's actually, connected his agency with all these Tea Party people coming threatening to kill our students and stalling on the demands. So this short statement, the BSU asked me to read to you, and if you would go to change.org and sign their petition, that would be helpful. There's over 1,040 signatures here. And it goes like this. The demands, the team represent the UC Irvine Black student demands, has made it known that the anti-Black university will no longer remain unchecked. That those who refer to themselves as administrators will have to recognize the violence that students are forced to withstand. That our pain will no longer be exchanged for profit. The deal was that, you guys passed the Black students demonstrating, and then the student government passing a ban on flags has caused us to lose 5% in donations in a 4-day period. I don't know where they got that figure from, nor why it matters more than their safety and the integrity of their student organizations. That the university, in rushing to protect its own interests in the midst of the flag controversy, has seen fit to stoke and validate overt threats of violence to Black students. The system has made threats of lynching possible, all the while demanding students to apologize for, quote, indefensible behavior. The BSU demands become imperative to hold this institution accountable to such unethical behavior. The demands made by Black students on this very campus have already called this offensive and indefensible behavior by the administration to the forefront. And with each effort to stall and bully us, the University of California, Irvine exposes its violent moments of slow and deliberate diversion. This will no longer be accepted. We would ask you to share and sign the petition to make the UC system know that there can be no way forward without us. They continue to try and silence us. We will only cry louder. So I encourage you to go to change.org and, if you're so inclined, sign the petition. Okay, so it's, as I say to my students, now I'm tired of working for my money. Actually, I was tired before I got into class. Yes, in the back.
I haven't fully articulated this question to you yet, but you kind of compared framing of white revolutionaries as part of a misguided family. There's this kind of family struggle that's not afforded to other groups. I was wondering if you could comment, like if you extended your arguments to the Palestinian case, how is that contextualized? Have you looked into that? You can talk about it now, or?
Yeah. So this is. I would encourage you to go to that. It's actually write it on the board. This book. Oh, thank you very much. What I said today was like a little piece of a long article. I'm going to answer the question.
Okay, yeah. No.
But, thank you. I'm sure you can get this book online somewhere, even though it's a German press. But it's called
on the sheet.
Oh, is it on the sheet? Oh,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, it's on the sheet. Okay, so because there's just so much that was shorthanded here.
Yeah.
So the actual point of that part of the argument, and in the argument I go through a lot of West German scholarship from the 90s trying to think, trying to make sense of the RAF violence. And for me, the most essential aspect of that scholarship is not the points of attention of the scholarship, but a metacritical continuum, that something that the scholarship shares. And one of the things that the scholarship shares is the way in which temporality is not problematized. I think, so what I'm saying at a kind of metacritical level, anytime you're talking about black people, you can't think temporality. Yes, and that's even though I believe that's true, it's a highly controversial argument amongst black studies across the nation. But, and so the way they think temporality is through filiation, which is a lot more reprehensible than the way, say, Said would meditate on the Palestinian context. So I don't think that the Palestinian, that the metacritical rebar behind theorization of the Palestinian conflict would manifest itself in the particulars of generational loss and rupture, the way that it does in West Germany. But I do think that it shares the assumption of a temporal progression. And that assumption of a temporal progression is precisely what I'm suggesting Assata is trying to work through. But, and if she was a non-black person in a therapeutic situation, the mode of analysis would get her to reinsert herself into temporality through a narrative that could be shared and critiqued by others. In other words, as Lacan says, you would speak full speech for your contemporaries. What I'm saying is psychoanalysis and political discourse assumes temporal progression. And that assumption is indicative of a contingent relationship to structural violence. I don't think black people can assume temporal progression because violence positions us first and then narrative fragments come in later. And so I'm suggesting that what her text is symptomatic of is the totalizing nature of violence, which means that it cannot be reconciled with the temporal arc. Both the Palestinian and the RAF political discourse can be reconciled, actually depend upon the narrative arc. When the narrative arc is manifest, it comes out differently. There was a time before the Nakba. For the RAF, there was a time when our kids were well behaved. But there still is a time before. And so, as Ronald Judy writes, blackness signifies nothing prior to the devastation that defines it.
Thoughts, thank you.
Okay. Hi. Yes.
I don't know if you touched on Afro-pessimism at all.
That's all this is. Yeah. Yes. Yes. I have.
Okay.
But not in a way that's totally clear. I've been working through the moves. But ask your question. I'm intrigued.
Well, my question simply is, what exactly is Afro-pessimism? Is this referring to African American situation and assuming that it can never get better, or is it continental Africa?
Well, I see. I subscribe to. So I would say that it's everywhere. For me.
Saying the black condition will never improve?
Well, it will improve but it cannot improve this is my position, it cannot improve in ways that can be articulated.
You can't imagine it, basically.
You can't, I don't believe you can imagine, because I'm a rhetorician of power, and what I have written and theorized is that every time, so I'll cut to the chase, because C.S. Song on Against the Grain asked me this, and I never like to say this, one, because it's beyond sedition, and, but he said, well, what would that take? And as I said here, Assata's, she's a threat to, her threat is catastrophic to the symbolic order, which means that she's a threat to the capacity to write sentences and imagine narrative. I said Ulrike Meinhof's threat is a threat to a certain type of manifestation of the symbolic order, which is the threat of the value form under capital. So I don't agree that with Marx that the end of capital is the end of the world. No, the end of the black condition is the end of the world, because the end of the black condition cannot be. Why I say that political discourse is anti-black is because, rhetorically speaking, all political discourse is predicated on two registers of narrative. One is description of the problem, and the second is prescription, which is Lenin's question, what is to be done. My second book, for $27, what this says is that every time, and I'm working through people like Antonio Negre and Native American scholars like Leslie Soko and Ward Churchill, and white feminists such as Sylvia Hartman, not Sylvia Hartman, sorry, blasphemy, don't strike me. Kaja Silverman. I'm saying that whenever they do the work, and then that work is appropriated for the black condition, what ends up happening is that it's the same thing that happens I'm no better in my private life, but intuitively is that when I talk about my problems, I ratchet them down so that I don't talk about the totality of them, because the totality would just make me crazy. It's as Jared Sexton, my colleague at UC Irvine once said when we were on a panel together, he says, it sounds like what you Afro-pessimists are saying is that there's no reason for black people to get up in the morning. And he said, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's no good reason to get up in the morning. And by that he meant that what's happening today is that black people, for example, in Black Lives Matter, are trying to make sense of police violence. And it is that very sense-making which lobs off the totality of what it means. And so what I've argued is that violence against subalterns, postcolonial subjects, or violence against non-black women, or violence against non-black working class has a certain utility, even if it looks crazy, because all violence looks kind of crazy. And that utility is to return this subject to a non-transgressive mode of living. I don't think you can, in other words, to not go on strike or to allow for the subject to have your land. I think that when you start thinking violence against black people through utility, you do yourself a disservice. Because I think that the violence against black people is actually necessary to the psychic health of everyone else. And that's why I'm arguing that the structure of violence which subsumes black people is not contingent upon transgressing some type of symbolic law. Orlando Patterson writes in Slavery and Social Debt, stratified society, meaning a capitalist society, has to start with an ocean of violence to get it going. So you need a couple hundred years at least of violence to move from feudalism to capitalism, to create a different paradigmatic position from peasant to worker. And he says something very interesting. And that is that once the violence has changed the terrain, so that now capitalism, not feudal aristocracy, so now capitalist relations subsume the globe, then that violence goes into remission. And it rears its ugly head when it is needed to maintain its structure. This is Gramsci's notion of the divide between civil society and political society. When the codes of hegemony can no longer contain the obedience of the working class, then political society kicks in with this violence. Patterson's argument, and it's foundational to my work, is that the violence of slavery, the prior violence that produces the slave condition or slave estate, is the current violence. So the prehistoric violence of the paradigm of slavery is the concurrent violence once this thing has been set up. And what that means is that the violence against the slave is pre-logical. The utility is simply, or complexly, depending upon how you look at it, a utility that maintains a division so that those who are not slaves can know themselves as not slaves, ultimately. If that is true, then we have to think of police terror completely differently, and not as some people would say a kind of handmaiden of neoliberal policies. Police terror against black people is functional to the psychic presence of everyone else. And if that is true, and that means that we're not struggling against neoliberal policies or ruling class, we're struggling against the instantiation of humanness itself. Which means that the end of humanness would put us on the cusp of an epistemological shift. And you can only do political discourse inside of the episteme in which you live. So I think that Fanon in Black Skin, White Mask writes beyond his own desire, which is to disalienate his psyche and to live with others in a wholesome way. But it's those moments of failure with respect to his psychoanalytic project, which I take to be most prescient for what I'm doing. And one of the things is he says the Negro is a Negro everywhere. That doesn't mean that anti-blackness is played out the same everywhere, but it does mean that social death follows, saturates black life wherever. That's my view. Oh, yes?
So could we view Afro-pessimism then as a way to explain a condition of not disillusionment, but of people not wanting to engage in the system or not wanting to because, or not necessarily that there is no hope, but that this is the framework from which we operate in. Not necessarily that we can't overcome this, but because
we can't overcome it, but if we talk about it, you know, because it's like, you know, I had a friend who was, I was doing work against the first Intifada, and his cousin blew himself up making a bomb in Ramallah. We were in Minneapolis, and it was very interesting. This is when I was, you know, a post-colonial revolutionary Marxist kind of thing, and I hadn't done, well, not to be reductive, but I hadn't really thought through how Marx had not thought the slave. He has two opportunities in Das Kapital, and he doesn't do it on both counts. Nor had I thought through the irrational essence of institutional arrangements. In other words, why the unconscious is as important as real tables and chairs, money and widgets, you know. And we're sitting on a grassy knoll, and I'm consoling him, and I'm still, you know, what he did doesn't make me like, I don't have a knee-jerk reaction of, no, I'm not down with the Palestinians. I mean, you know, it just means that once Palestine takes over Israel, now we're going to have to deal with them. Okay, it doesn't mean, and he says, you know, he's weeping and asking about issues in Ramallah, and he says, you know, he begins talking as though he's talking to himself, which I'm taking as a form of brotherhood, because, you know, there's no static between us. But he forgets that I'm black, right? And he says, it's really horrible to get to a checkpoint and for me and my mom and sisters to be, patted down. That is so humiliating. And I'm like, yeah, I can only imagine. He says, but it's double humiliating when it's an Ethiopian Jew. I'm thinking, last time I checked, your shit was with the Israeli whites, You're not at war with black Jews, So, and this is what the middle 88 pages of this book is about, is the way in which Native American scholars and Native American literary production theorizes genocide as the thing that happens, what destroys them. True, but the emotional weight is often greater with respect to their threat, their perceived threat of the incursion of black cultural icons into their cultural stability. And that I find very interesting, in the way in which they can forget that blacks are implements and think blacks emotionally, and this happens in literature and film more profoundly, but also happens with Vine Deloria in an analysis. They can have the textual heat of black incursion into their spatial and temporal integrity is as emotionally threatening as the cats who killed 12 million of them. So negrophobia is the essence of psychic regeneration, regardless of what race you are. It is the essence, whether you're Palestinian, Native American, Israeli, or white. Yes?
I had a question. You mentioned how the event of gender, in the case of the slave, is violated or disarticulated by rape and castration. And this is a very open question. I was wondering if you could talk more about that, especially in relation to your writings on Italian Marxist feminism. It's a broad, open question.
Yes. Well, my wife and I were just talking about that on the train, actually, but I kind of forgot. Okay. No. So let me put it like this. The Italian feminist Marxist Maria della Rosa and Leopoldina Fortunati. I mean, I love their work, but I don't think it translates to thinking black feminists, black female suffering, or black feminist theorizing.
I guess my question was like the category of feminism in relation to like the black subject. Like, how is that a category that's legible for that?
Okay, so here's the deal.
Yeah.
There are black feminists who have taught me, and so black feminism, as you know, I'm telling everybody, I'm sure you understand this, is a broad field.
Right.
And so, of course, my favorite black feminists are going to be people like Zakiya Jackson, Sylvia Wynter, and Saidiya Hartman, and also Hortense Spillers. But Hortense Spillers allows Saidiya Hartman to do the work. She clears a path, just like Saidiya Hartman allows me to do the work. I don't have to hide what I'm saying, my condemnation of civil society, in an allegory about the 19th century, because Saidiya Hartman wrote about the 19th century because she did it, and so the thing of it is that if you think, it's not that feminism is irrelevant, it's that what Hartman and Winters and Zakiya Jackson and others who are like now working on the dissertations, I mean, in 5 years there are going to be like 10 badass black feminists doing Afro-pessimism. Patrice Douglas from UC Irvine, Sally Tarefe, and you'll see their dissertation come books, and you'll see that what they're doing is an engagement with feminism as an interrogation of the category. Yeah. So what Afro-pessimism doesn't offer, I think this is what I wanted to kind of lost my train, want to say, is it is an explanatory apparatus. You can't take it and say, here's how I do politics. Now, what's interesting to me is that and I had never in my wildest imagination, when I stole or was given the term from Hartman and put it in this book, I never thought there would be political engagements with this. I mean, Jared Sachs and I suffered for 7 years in the ethnic studies department for him, and in rhetoric for me, having Silverman and different people tell us that what we were doing was redundant kind of thing. We never imagined that there'd be more than 3 people in a room listening like this, right? I think it offers an explanatory paradigm, and because it's a critique of the hopefulness of political discourse, and because if you look at black people when they get old, our parents, I mean, they're always struggling to keep that positivity going that they had younger, and some of them just give it, and they do weird shit, right? I mean, I knew a person who was like a button-up professor, right? And out east, and his daughter called me once, and he had retired. And one day he just woke up from retirement and got a gun and went down to the office where he was teaching. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on again. So, she got him like, "Dad, what are you doing?" He says, "I'm do something I should have done 10 fucking years ago." And people are like, "Oh, this black person went crazy." No, he actually got sanity, right? It's like, that's not. And if you look at James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, with all this love and gushing possibility, and then the evidence of things not seen when he's in his 60s, and he says, "This is just what America does. It just kills our children. It's essential to its regeneration." I mean, so what Albert Pessimist is trying to do is capture the kind of symptomatic sense-making of those old black people who don't feel a need to make their utterances of contempt articulate with their coalition partners anymore, because at the end of their life, to do the work now and just see where the chips fall. So I think what Hartman's contribution is that in the court cases that she writes about, she's saying, isn't it horrible that black women are raped just repeatedly at will, that there's no justice that comes out of that, that the only way that you can actually get towards thinking about it is if the courts will narrate the injury as the injury that happens to her husband, his loss of honor so there's a kind of double eraser going on here. But then she doesn't say, here's how we solve it, because she goes on to say, here's why it's impossible to resolve it, because the libidinal economy cannot unconsciously or consciously offer or accept the concept of consent to black feminine positionality. And that's vital to political discourse. Gramsci's whole project is anchored on the withdrawal or presence of spontaneous consent. And even people who think that the autonomia movement has done something different, if you look at them closely, there's still a temporal progression. Because they're not saying that the worker is outside of consent. They're saying that the Nixon taking the dollar off the gold standard has put us into a post-industrial condition where the command modality of capitalism and its violence subsumes even the faculty meeting, and so therefore, as Michael Hart writes, I live prison time. But if you read it closely, what he's saying, there was a time prior to this when I didn't live prison time. What Hartman is saying is that the whole of this ship is the metaphor for the elaboration of black existence. There's no time prior to that. And so it's, and if you read Fortunati and the Italian feminists, and to kind of turn your head sideways and look at their verb and noun structure, it's really textual, even though they're really badass street fighters, and I support them and love their concepts, but it's really textual. It's all about redaction and masking. It's about the masking and redaction of the commodity form. and how the process of unmasking and reinscribing that commodity form across all terrains, from the terrain of so-called production to the terrain of reproduction, will then have a pedagogic effect upon male and female working class, and in a kind of Gramscian move, they will move from common sense to good sense, and know that both reproductive labor is productive labor, because it is confronted by the wage just as much as the person in the factory, and then they'll move on to state with violence. It doesn't really matter whether black people are mystified or not. No one is concerned with black hegemony. No one is concerned with black consent. People are worried when black people start moving around, okay? You know, but that's not a discursive issue, right? That's like how many blacks are there, right? You know, cool, come to my crib, just don't bring your friends, you know? 1 or 2 on a corner, not 3. You know, it's like it's a violent response to a potential violent reaction. There's no conversation here.
Thank you.
Oh, yes.
So I'm coming from a good place with this question, and it's kind of a devil's advocate one. How do you respond to like a critique that Afro-pessimists have sort of like taken the bait of liberal multiculturalism?
Has taken the bait
Yeah.
of?
Liberal multiculturalism, where all these different people of color are in their different respective identity-based silos and are essentialized. And Afro-pessimism, well, I think like a critique of anti-black racism is different from other forms of racism, but naturalizes, you know, this intrinsic separation between different groups.
So just kind of, I'm like a deer in headlights for the moment.
And I'm like, wait, I don't know, I don't want to.
I think I understand, but can you kind of spin it a little differently, so I'm sure, or maybe ask it like I was 6, because that's how I feel right now.
So, for example, I'm going to cite a passage from your second book where you explain why you don't include Asians and Latinos in your structure of your social as evoking a culture, or politics of culture, as opposed to culture of politics.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Well, what I mean is that when, in my view, when blacks are at their best, in other words, thinking suffering by itself, because normally we're thinking suffering, then the next kind of intuitive move is, how do we make what we're saying to each other legible to someone else? But when we're just kind of thinking suffering, it is not burdened by what I would call conservative discursive accoutrement. And those are like sentences and concepts which really boil down to the problem of access to civil society. So immigration, even voting rights. I mean, there's part of the problem of thinking the civil rights movement is that so much of there's a kind of hydraulics on all scholarship about, especially history about the civil rights, and Lawrence Hill broke this with his Deacons for Defense book, because one of the things and he almost didn't get it published, because what he was saying is that if you actually take some of the tape recordings of meetings between Deacons for Defense and key civil rights leaders, then what you find is that it's not true that only the Deacons for Defense were talking about just going off and offing people or blowing stuff up. You know, that was part of the psychic zeitgeist of people who were later going out and saying, we shall overcome, and we're absolutely about nonviolence. So the discourse, the history, and as a result of that, he almost didn't get it published because it was every, to write an academic book, you have to send it to outside readers. Every outside reader said that this was a form of blasphemy in a way, and it was fortunate that the press got negative reviews and published it anyway. And there are actually tape recordings of some of these things happening. So there's a way in which the world has ended, or doesn't even exist, for the black psyche. And David Merritt explains this by saying that, can we really say black people have an unconscious when it's being used, he says, what do you do with an unconscious that appears to hate you? In other words, and the appearance has, the verb has two meanings to it, right? So I think that, I hope I'm not getting too far away from your question, am I? Does this help me?
No, I think this is fair. I asked like one of those hard questions.
So I think that what you have in kind of people of color political discourse, even in its most kind of rabid, aggressive performance, is really a kind of hyper attenuated desire to make more elastic the contrariness of civil society. And whether black people have that or not, they can't embody it. And that's what's really interesting, is that there's, every time a black person takes a place, the actual spatial and temporal components of that space just kind of magically disappear, as what happens with Obama. You can be president, but you can't be presidential. And so so that's what I mean. When black people try to do a politics of culture, it really fails.
Yeah.
It becomes a compensatory provisional gesture. And so, but no one else wants to do a culture of politics, because ultimately, like my friend in Ramallah, it threatens the very thing they're trying to attain. There can be no state, Palestinian or Israeli, that doesn't have a fundamental anti-blackness as its mechanism for psychic integration. It just can't happen.
Thank you.
Yes?
I guess a two-part question that's more of an invitation on two kind of broad themes.
More of
An invitation.
invitation.
And the first one is, I have a question about cartography.
Yes.
When thinking about specifically Catherine McKittrick's work on black geographies that aren't traditional ideas of geographies, right? And so I'm curious, like, what you think about that, because I feel like cartographic incoherence, right, is so fundamental to your arguments. And by the way, thank you for the talk. It was great work. And the other question, or another kind of set of questions, is about genre. And I'm curious about the communiqué as a genre and what you think about that. Because what strikes me on the handout is that you have several communiques and then you have this poem.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about form and genre and how these are not narratives, if that makes sense. How like genre plays with the idea of narrative or can maybe unsettle it.
I don't know exactly how to answer either one. Just to be honest, a little punch drunk, but so there's a lot. I mean, every time someone comes before you or you read someone, there's something that they can help you with, and then there's something that they can't help you with. And I would, Zakiya Jackson, I can't remember where she is right now. I was with her at I don't know if she's at Vanderbilt, University of Virginia. But one of the things that she does is she honors the provisional splits and reconfigurations of black filiation between trans people who identify themselves as trans or queer and who are black. But she doesn't, and so this is kind of resonant with your question on different cartographies. And so that's a kind of labor that she thinks is useful. But it's not useful for the purpose of consolidating subjectivity. It's because so where Black theory, where Afro-pessimism might be different from other Black theories, is that I don't think we have anything to offer people who are Black who want to have presence in the world. And that's the tricky point, because and I'm not saying that I'm so purely Afro-pessimist that I don't face these problems. I mean, my daughter's 27, but all through her childhood it was like, she'd wake up in the morning and say, oh, you're socially dead, so why bother? But I think that but I also realized that, and this was when I was in South Africa, that because I thought I was with the ANC, and at the time I was teaching Gramsci's and a little bit of Negri's work for the Communist Party until I was never in it, but just too unorthodox, to be with it. But I also believe that we in South Africa could overthrow the state and make something different, like give my child a futurity that I never had in the United States. And I began to realize that wasn't true, not just because the sellout model follows what Fanon is saying about the national bourgeoisie. It's not true because even though my comrades in South Africa had a cosmology, language, and a certain genuine individuated relationship to the land, there was no way that thing could be recognized and incorporated into what the third term mediated objects of the rest of the world. Number one. Number two, I realized that the things that one takes for fatherly granted cannot be, I'm not invested with them. So when she asks for protection, I can't protect myself. So there has to be, so I think that what Zakiya Jackson does is to try and help people understand the futility of gender and filiation, and to value whatever provisional amalgamations and reconfigurations that they embark upon, but not to invest that process with what is known as agency, but to invest it with another way of living death. Tenzin, did you have something?
I think people should ask.
Do you think, is there any positive way of thinking in interventions upon this politic of the unconsciousness and the precognitive? I mean, given that you say that the unconsciousness is so important, so if there is do you visualize any intervention?
Yes, but they're depending upon where you are, they're really brutal and ugly. In other words, I think that my third book is actually going to kind of take the Black Liberation Army as a kind of metaphor, or there are people who are working on the Black Liberation Army in terms of specific historicizing of it and its actions. What I'm thinking, I'm grateful to the BLA for what it did and for what its failures, in other words, the response of the state and civil society, for what it teaches me. So so what I mean by that is that there was a kind of conceptual. So I'm saying that the insurgency that the Black Liberation Army embarked upon was highly instructive, not for the purposes that it articulated, which is that ultimately we will have a liberated zone in the Black Belt, Georgia, Alabama, those states down there. I'm not interested primarily in its narrative intention. What I'm interested in is in the way in which their violent insurgency, pushing of the envelope, brings out the negrophobic fabric of the world, of civil society and the state, and educates me and helps me with a critique of IRA, RAF, and Palestinian insurgency. It helps so that violence is productive. It's productive because it educates me that I am always a refugee in some other person's political struggle, like my friend from Ramallah. It also suggests that it also helps me understand negrophilia, which is to say, why in the 80s I can go to Morocco before cell phones, and internet, and social media to the Jama El Afna, the Assembly of the Dead, and hear Marvin Gaye playing everywhere. Okay. In other words, what comes out of the black social death, which is to say, being subsumed by a violence that cannot be narrated, is a yearning for a place within narration that is so powerful that everyone in the world wants a piece of it. It comes out of black music. And that's why so many multicultural political struggles like black people in the mix for that uncompromising energy, and then don't want them around when they get their shit, right? You know, it's just like the family scene. You know, come but don't bring your friends, right? And so I think all of that has a pedagogic value for me and other black people. It also suggests that no matter what our numbers, our threat is far greater in the psychic apparatus, the collective unconscious, than our actual physical numeric presence is. Because, as I said before, what we threaten is the capacity to theorize, not this type of theorization itself. And so, as Saidiya Hartman says, you know, when she was helping me with my dissertation, she said, you better watch out because most people who think of themselves as revolutionaries don't want to be as free as black people can make them. You know, that's freedom from their own cultural identity. That's not, you know, that's freedom from, this is I mean, black liberation becomes an oxymoron. We're talking about the end of an epistemological arrangement. Precisely because it is not dialectical. I don't know, I see your knitted brow. What do you want to follow up?
The dialectical, if this is not dialectical, is what is it?
Well, you see, if you have a situation in which between the IRA and the British, you have a struggle over competing conceptions of how to arrange cartography. And so there are two terms on the dialectic which will evolve into, you know, into something, a liberated zone. The same with the worker. You have a struggle between two conceptions of how to organize time. It's a bloody, violent conception, but there is the potential for synthesis. But between absence and presence, there's not a synthesis. And that's, I mean, in other words, so you see, it's necessary for both groups to perform some kind of violence repetitively on the slave to make their war coherent to themselves, which is the symptom of my friend's thought. It's horrible to be patted down by an Israeli, but it's worse when you're patted down by an Ethiopian Jew. Because that is that is a consensual arrangement, even though it is largely unconscious. It is a consensual arrangement between him and the Israeli. And it's that consensual arrangement which actually gives their bloody war its coherence. How are we doing? I don't know what you're...
Can I ask you a question?
Yes. I don't know if I can answer it.
I don't know
All right, all right.
if I'm sure about the question itself, but it's something that's discussed quite often in relation to the value form, like the way you've critiqued it. Quite often you've talked about Marxism, but went to Gramsci to discuss how the value form as a way to think about subject formation sort of suffers when it comes to the black subject. There are sort of Marxian theorists who are rejecting Gramsci, but they're not rejecting the value form, to think about the relation between white supremacy and capitalism, and how race, and then in particular blackness, is sort of part of the totality of capital, and therefore struggle against that totality is something that actually also questions and critiques and possibly dismantles white supremacy. This is not my perspective, my position, but this is a very serious position, and they're very serious about reading your critique, and I've been thinking about this because in your work you're quite clear about how race comes from the way the conventional notion of Marxism, in which racial formation is sort of part of the ideology, but not part of the actual base at which this violence is taking place. So you're sort of questioning that entire model. So would it be possible, what's your critique of sort of the kind of anti-capitalist thought, which they're also critical of Gramsci's notion of hegemony, etc., etc. This notion of capital as so totalizing that now we're actually seeing that it is, to them, that it is in fact the critique of capital is the critique of white supremacy. And how, and more specifically, the critique of anti-blackness. How do you actually deal with this, that entire genre of writing and thinking and doing politics, actually?
Okay, so the last question is, how do I think about it in terms of doing politics? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I'm really enthused by the fact that Hannibal and yourself and people in Oakland are making political sense of this. I just wanted to get this down and get out of graduate school before all the people at Berkeley told me I was crazy, and so and it's very interesting that in South Africa, the economic freedom fighters who now have seats in Parliament are I went there in 2012 and gave lectures on Afro-pessimism, and they've been reading it and working. I mean, so Afro-pessimism is like part of the text of the economic freedom fighters' political struggle against white supremacy and the ANC. But at this particular moment in time, and I would encourage people to look more on the internet about this, there's a split. And I think Afro-pessimism is part and parcel of the split, precisely because, in my view, for the populace, they're not willing, Malema's people, in my view, they're not willing to do politics, to try to have two trains running, in which you do politics which is not as big as your theoretical apparatus. In other words, you're just, okay, you got to get food and water for people, you got to get the land back, but you can also have a theoretical apparatus which critiques your practices. When you move on that and get to a certain place, then you don't think that you've arrived. And I think that the Malema's wing of the Economic Freedom Front, in my view, is not willing to have an analysis of the problem in South Africa that is bigger than their political tools. The other thing is I'm trying to wind my way back to the specificity of your question, although I don't have a clear answer for it. But I think what Sexton would start the move, Jared Sexton would start the move by saying that white supremacy is what all people of color suffer. And that it has diminished explanatory power, because anti-blackness was what the slave suffers. And so he wants to really, really profoundly draw a critical line between the theorization of white supremacy and the theorization of anti-blackness, so that they're not conflated. Because my white supremacy, it's on all the Israeli TVs, but I suffer through him anti-blackness. Now, I too have left Gramsci behind, but but not in the way that. And I know you've sent me some articles on this, which I haven't had a chance to really read yet. So I'm going to do a kind of general sweep with Hart and Negri. I think that the analysis can work on several levels. In other words, it is, I believe, Hart and Negri when they write that we all now live prison time. The Gramscian model of civil society no longer is relevant because there is no imagined or real kind of space or moment of respite. That everything that the violence of the value form has now subsumed all of the socius, and so it's not even possible to think through counter-hegemonic logic. And my short answer right now is that that's true, but blacks are workers and slaves. And so the Negrian multitude is itself, as a category the Negrian multitude is a figure of narrative progression. When Negri's writing from the 50s, the factory worker and 70s, and then the movement to the multitude with autonomia, that's a progression in which he's marking the recomposition of class based upon the violent reaction of class resistance to value. If you believe Hartman, there's no progression that is essential to the structure of black suffering. The only thing that happens is that natal alienation, general dishonor, and the openness to gratuitous violence reconfigures itself. The technology changes and morphs as blacks resist. But what Negri is a significant shift. Not only that, but he's saying that the category of the worker can change fundamentally, paradigmatically, in ways that you can actually think about. I don't think that black life can change in ways that you can think about. I think it can change, but as C.S. Song Against the Grain asked me, so what does that mean? I said, it's a violence so magnificent and comprehensive that you can't even theorize it, He says, specifically, what does that look like? That's for me to know and you to find out, right? Okay, I thought it was funny. It was maybe my own private joke. I just had to be on one side of it, actually. So it's this capacity to not just to transform, but to theorize that transformation I think, you know, when my undergraduates are kind of, I say to them, just bring it back to the one word violence. And there's a way in which violence has a temporality in all Marxist thought, whether it rejects Gramsci or not. And what Hartman and myself and David Marriott, my God, and Sexton are saying is that there is no temporality to the violence that black people are subsumed by.
Afro-pessimism has yet to articulate sort of a politics, and this has sort of been dealt with by the shift from like Black Lives Matter to maybe Black Life Matter, things like that. But I mean, how does one, if it's possible, maybe these are two different registers, but deal with the question of sort of solidarity or these like tropes or discourses about intersectionality? I mean, yeah.
Well, I mean, no, I know it's a general. I kind of don't care about that.
Okay, that's enough of an answer.
But no, that's not a scholarly answer, though. You see, I think that, and this is, I mean, it's a serious question, and it has repercussions. It's having repercussions for me right now as a full professor, because when people first start to read that, oh, this is really sexy, this is edgy, this is, you know, but then when they really get into it, they're like, well, you're condemning me prior to my performance? You know, this is a condemnation of me in my existence, and then you have to say, oh yeah, okay, you know, through you. This is my friend in Ramallah, you know. So in point of fact, there's a kind of line of diminishing returns when it doesn't have, it not only doesn't have usefulness for other people, but it holds them in such contempt for their capacity to be that it's really hard to embrace. I think what it does for black people is that it allows us to, it doesn't say stop being politically active. I'm always politically active, but I also recognize that I'll be 59 years old in a few weeks, and I've been politically active since I was 12 years old. 90% of that activism has been in service to other people's causes. 90% of it. And so I think that just as a kind of zeitgeist, it helps black people to be in a coalition, genuinely moving in it, while ridiculing their coalition partners at the same time. So that there's actually no emotive responsibility to the coalition partners at that moment. Not perform a disciplinary act of an attitude. It's like I said to my friend, we're going to get our shit, then we're going to help you get Israel, then we're coming for you. And that's I think so it has important emotional and pedagogic value for black people, and it invites other people to fall into the abyss of death. It was an interesting, I mean, there was a moment, and this is about authorization, really, in politics, because